Breaking in these shattering hours, Ukraine unleashes a barrage of precision strikes on the heart of Russia, with drones and missiles slamming into Moscow and St. Petersburg, igniting chaos across the Kremlin's doorstep and sending shockwaves through the global order. Sources on the ground report explosions rattling windows in the capital's government districts, while across the Neva in Petersburg, key infrastructure lights up in flames, as Ukrainian forces, emboldened by Western tech, target symbols of power that once seemed untouchable. The world holds its breath, air raid sirens wail through Moscow's subways, evacuating thousands in the dead of night, and footage emerges of debris scattering across Red Square, where emergency crews scramble amid the acrid smoke. This isn't retaliation, it's a bold escalation, piercing the veil of Russia's red lines, with initial tallies suggesting over 50 projectiles launched from hidden launchers in the east, bypassing defenses that have held for years. Putin, sources whisper, retreats to bunkers as advisors scramble, the panic palpable in the hurried footsteps of officials fleeing the blasts. Eyewitnesses describe the surreal horror, the sky streaked with trails of fire, ground shaking like an earthquake, and the once impenetrable shields of the motherland cracking under the weight of this audacious assault. But this is just the spark. What follows could engulf the continent in flames we can't extinguish. To catch every pulse-pounding update as this war's front lines shift into Russia's core, subscribe right now and stay locked in. We'll peel back the layers of the political frenzy gripping the Kremlin next. Kremlin spokesmen issue defiant broadcasts, claiming Ukrainian strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg amount to desperate provocations from a failing regime, yet internal memos leaked to Western outlets reveal Putin's inner circle fracturing under the assault's weight, with urgent calls for emergency Politburo sessions to recalibrate red lines that have crumbled overnight. In these critical hours, the White House convenes the National Security Council, issuing statements of measured support for Kyiv's right to self-defense while privately urging restraint to avoid nuclear thresholds, a contradiction that underscores Washington's dual game, public solidarity masking fears of escalation that could draw in over 30 NATO allies. European leaders react in a cascade. The French president demands an immediate UN Security Council debate, decrying the attacks as violations of sovereignty, but French diplomats quietly signal to Moscow channels offering mediation if Ukraine halts further barrages, revealing the chasm between rhetorical outrage and pragmatic de-escalation bids. Contrasts sharpen across the Atlantic. London's Foreign Secretary condemns the strikes yet accelerates arms shipments to Kyiv totaling £2 billion in precision munitions, actions that belie official calls for dialogue and expose the alliance's internal schisms, where Baltic states push for harsher sanctions on Russia while Berlin hesitates, citing energy dependencies that still bind Germany to Gazprom pipelines supplying 40% of its needs. In Moscow, the presidential administration broadcasts assurances of ironclad retaliation, but satellite intelligence shows evacuation protocols activating for 100 key officials, a move that contradicts the facade of unflappable control and hints at genuine disarray in the command structure. Beijing's foreign ministry issues a neutral call for all parties to exercise restraint, yet state media amplifies narratives of Western aggression, positioning China to capitalize on the chaos by offering Russia discounted loans worth $5 billion to bolster defenses, a subtle pivot that pits professed neutrality against opportunistic deepening of the Sino-Russian axis. The rift widens in the global south. India's prime minister avoids direct condemnation, instead convening talks with both sides to secure neutral sourcing of Ukrainian grain exports disrupted by the war, amounting to 10 million tons annually, while Brazil and South Africa through BRICS channels urge a ceasefire, their statements clashing with covert overtures to purchase Russian oil at discounts of 30% below market rates. Putin's public address, delivered from an undisclosed location, vows proportionate response without specifics, but intercepted communications suggest debates raging over whether to activate tactical nuclear options or limit to cyber countermeasures, a divergence that lays bare the Kremlin's vulnerability, official bravado masking a scramble to unify a leadership divided on the path forward. Warsaw mobilizes its parliament for emergency resolutions, demanding EU-wide sanctions that could freeze Russian assets exceeding €1 trillion, yet Hungary's veto threats stall the process, highlighting the European bloc's fractured front where eastern flanks clamor for confrontation while Western economies prioritize stability. This political vortex swirls with unspoken tensions. Ukraine's Zelensky hails the strikes as justified payback, but his envoys in Brussels face quiet rebukes from allies wary of provoking a response that might engulf the continent, creating a tapestry of declarations versus deeds where every summit and statement peels back layers of hypocrisy. Official narratives clash relentlessly. Russia labels the assault terrorism backed by NATO, yet refrains from immediate invasion of western Ukraine, buying time to assess damages estimated at 3 billion rubles in the first wave alone. The contrast crystallizes. words of unity from the Kremlin belie a leadership in flux, where the strikes have not just hit infrastructure but the very pillars of authoritarian control, forcing a re-evaluation of alliances that once seemed eternal. But this political storm only sets the stage for the raw force unfolding on the military front. Sirens pierce the night as Ukrainian drones swarm Moscow's skies, evading S-400 systems to strike the Defense Ministry headquarters, shattering windows and igniting fires that engulf 3 floors, while in St. Petersburg, a salvo of 20 ATACMS missiles rains down on naval docks, crippling 2 frigates in dry dock and scattering debris across the Neva that blocks shipping lanes for 500 meters. The tempo explodes, Russian air defenses roar to life, downing 70% of the incoming barrage, but the survivors carve paths of destruction, hitting fuel depots in the capital that spew black smoke visible from 20 kilometers away, forcing the evacuation of 15,000 civilians from surrounding districts as flames leap 30 meters high. Ground Zero pulses with chaos. In Moscow, special forces cordon off Red Square after a near miss on the Kremlin walls, their boots pounding pavement as they sweep for unexploded ordnance, while helicopters ferry reinforcements from the airborne divisions, 200 troops dropping in under 10 minutes to secure the perimeter. The rhythm hammers on. Petersburg's military airfield scrambles Su-35 fighters, engines screaming as they intercept follow-up waves, but Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles slip through, pulverizing radar arrays that once blanketed the northwest, leaving gaps in coverage spanning 100 kilometers and exposing flanks to further incursions. Short, sharp bursts define the frenzy. A single drone detonates over the Peter and Paul fortress, shaking historic spires and alerting 5,000 garrison personnel to battle stations, their rifles clicking in the dark as searchlights sweep the horizon. Moscow activates its layered shields, panzer units firing in staccato rhythm to shred 8 incoming projectiles mid-air, yet fragments rain down on residential blocks, injuring over 100 and prompting metro shutdowns that strand 2 million commuters underground. The surge intensifies. Russian strategic bombers lift off from Engels Base, 100 kilometers southeast, carrying hypersonic Kinzhal warheads primed for counterstrikes on Ukrainian launch sites, their contrails etching the dawn sky as ground crews load 20 additional missiles in a race against time. Eyewitnesses capture the raw edge, the thunder of explosions rolling like artillery barrages, soldiers in tactical gear dashing through cordons, and the acrid bite of cordite hanging heavy, turning familiar streets into war zones where every shadow hides threat. Belarusian radars lock onto the chaos, relaying data to Moscow that reveals Ukrainian batteries repositioning near Kyiv, 40 launchers rolling into new hides under cover of electronic jamming that blinds Russian satellites for 15 minutes at a stretch. The drama accelerates relentlessly. Kaliningrad's Baltic Fleet surges patrols, submarines slipping from moorings to shadow NATO vessels in the Gulf of Finland, while Ukrainian special ops teams, inserted by Black Hawk insertions, sabotage rail lines north of Kyiv, derailing 3 supply trains carrying 5,000 tons of munitions bound for the front. In the heat of retaliation, Putin orders the activation of Iskander batteries along the border, 120 systems unleashing a volley that craters Ukrainian airfields, destroying 10 MiG-29s on the tarmac and cratering runways over 2 kilometers long, but the cost mounts as Russian losses tally 5 billion rubles in hardware alone from the initial strikes. The pulse races toward breaking point. Air traffic controllers ground all civilian flights from Sheremetyevo and Pulkovo, stranding 20,000 passengers as FSB sweeps arrest suspected saboteurs in the terminals, their interrogations yielding leads on drone supply chains tracing back to Polish borders. This military maelstrom isn't contained, it's a vortex pulling in reinforcements from across the Federation, with motorized rifle brigades mobilizing 30,000 troops toward the west, tanks rumbling over frozen earth in columns stretching 10 kilometers. Warsaw scrambles its air force, 24 F-somethings patrolling the skies over the Suwalki Gap, radars pinging Russian signals that probe too close, while Vilnius deploys anti-air batteries along its frontiers, the whine of generators underscoring the brink. The intensity builds like a gathering storm, every intercepted transmission crackles with urgency, orders barked in clipped tones as commanders weigh the leap from defense to all-out assault, where the skies over Russia's heart become the new battleground. But amid this fury of fire and steel, the economic tremors from these blows are already cracking the foundations far beyond the blast zones. Commodity exchanges worldwide shudder under the onslaught. Brent crude vaults 25% in London as Moscow's refineries, hammered by Ukrainian strikes, slash output by 1 million barrels per day, forcing Europe to scramble for alternatives that drain strategic reserves holding 200 million barrels across NATO stockpiles. The breadth unfolds in stark terms. the ruble craters 15% against the euro in Frankfurt, wiping out 3 trillion rubles in market capitalization for Gazprom shares alone, while St. Petersburg's port, crippled by dockside blasts, halts container traffic equivalent to 500,000 tons of exports monthly, rippling delays into global supply chains for electronics components sourced from Siberian mines. Beijing's Commerce Ministry alerts factories in Guangdong to a projected shortfall of 800,000 tons of Russian nickel quarterly, inflating battery production costs by 30% and stalling electric vehicle assembly lines that churn out 2 million units annually, prompting frantic bids for Indonesian ore at premiums of 22%. In this expansive ledger, Ukraine's audacious hits disrupt rail arteries funneling 10 billion cubic meters of natural gas westward, causing prices in Amsterdam to triple and blacking out industrial zones in the Netherlands where over 50,000 workers face furloughs amid the squeeze. Brussels summons energy envoys for crisis talks, projecting a 1.5% contraction in Eurozone growth if blackouts persist beyond 72 hours, with German automakers like BMW idling plants in Munich that produce 100,000 vehicles per month, reliant on uninterrupted Russian steel flows now severed. The impersonal calculus extends. Russia's central bank injects 2 trillion rubles in emergency liquidity to prop the currency, yet inflation surges 8% overnight, eroding purchasing power for 140 million citizens and spiking food prices by 18% in Moscow supermarkets where shelves empty of imported grains totaling 3 million tons yearly. Ankara maneuvers swiftly, offering to reroute $1 billion in Turkish stream gas volumes through the Black Sea at discounted rates of 15%, a ploy to lock in long-term deals that offset Russia's losses while bolstering Turkey's leverage in NATO talks. Further reaches feel the strain. New Delhi's refineries, dependent on Ural's crude shipments of 2 million barrels daily, face surcharges of 25% via alternative Indian Ocean routes, delaying fuel distribution that powers 80% of the nation's transport fleet and risking shortages in rural districts serving 500 million people. Seoul's shipbuilding sector halts contracts worth $6 billion as steel deliveries from the Urals, disrupted by the strikes, add 4 weeks to timelines, cascading into higher costs for container vessels that dominate global trade lanes carrying 90% of world goods. International voices amplify the alarm. The World Bank forecasts a global growth shave of 0.8% from this escalation, with commodity indices tumbling 7% in New York and Asian bourses shedding $2 trillion in value as investors flee to safe havens like gold, which climbs 12% in a single session. The frozen geography of finance reveals fractures. Kaliningrad's exclave, already strained, diverts funds totaling €1 billion to repair logistics hit indirectly by the chaos, while Belarusian borders tighten further, blocking cross-border trade valued at €400 million weekly and isolating Minsk's economy in a vice of sanctions and shortages. In the sweeping vista, this assault transcends borders, fracturing the energy web that binds Eurasia. Sanctions from the G7 could freeze Russian overseas assets exceeding $500 billion, accelerating de-dollarization pushes with China that reshape trade in yuan for 20% of bilateral exchanges. Warsaw allocates 3 billion zlotys from EU recovery funds to fortify its grid against spillover blackouts, yet even these buffers strain as Polish exports to Ukraine, amounting to €1.2 billion in machinery, face retaliatory tariffs from Moscow. The global reaction compounds. Tokyo intervenes in currency markets with 5 trillion yen to steady the yen, wary of disruptions to rare earth imports from Russian deposits supplying 10% of Japan's tech needs, while Brasilia through Mercosur channels seeks emergency wheat shipments from Ukraine's disrupted harvests of 20 million tons, inflating Latin American food costs by 14%. This economic colossus trembles not from isolated blasts but from the interconnected veins now severed, where every halted shipment and spiked price recalibrates power dynamics, forcing nations to confront the cost of proxy wars in the currency of scarcity and survival. Yet in the hush following this fiscal thunder, the human psyche bears the deepest scars, the intangible fractures that linger long after the markets close. As the echoes of explosions fade into an uneasy silence over Moscow and St. Petersburg, we stand at the precipice of a deeper inquiry. What does Ukraine's daring penetration of Russia's core reveal about the unraveling psyche of a superpower and the world it once dominated? This assault pierces not just concrete and steel but the collective armor of invincibility, instilling a profound unease among 140 million Russians who now question the fortress narrative peddled for decades, with urban dwellers in the capitals reporting heightened paranoia as air raid drills displace 2 million from their routines, fostering a national mood swing from stoic endurance to simmering dread that could erode morale across the Federation's vast expanse. For ordinary citizens, the strikes symbolize a shattering of illusions. Families huddled in basements, children shielded from the glow of burning skylines, embody the psychological toll where every siren wail reinforces a sense of siege, potentially spiking mental health crises by 30% in affected regions as therapists brace for waves of anxiety disorders mirroring those seen in Kyiv after initial invasions. Putin himself, portrayed as unassailable, confronts a personal unraveling. Sources describe his isolation in secure compounds, the weight of perceived betrayal amplifying a siege mentality that hardens resolve yet sows seeds of doubt among elites, where loyalty oaths from 500 key officials mask underlying fears of regime fragility exposed by strikes that bypass defenses guarding 1,000 kilometers of frontier. Globally, the human spirit recoils. Europeans in Berlin and Paris, long insulated by distance, now confront the specter of spillover, with surveys indicating 65% altering travel plans to the east amid a philosophical shift toward re-evaluating peace as conditional, not guaranteed, stirring debates on the cost of deterrence in a world where proxy conflicts claim over 1 million lives since the war's dawn. What meaning does this hold for us, caught in the crosscurrents of history's fury? It unveils the fragility of power's facade, where the psychological scars outlast physical ruins. Ukrainians, emboldened by the blows, channel collective trauma into defiance, their resolve tempered by the knowledge that striking the heart extracts a psychic victory worth more than territorial gains, yet at the risk of inviting retaliation that could displace 10 million more in border zones. Philosophically, this moment compels reflection on resilience's double edge. Nations forged in adversity, like Russia with its storied endurance through 20 world-altering conflicts, now face an internal erosion where propaganda battles a reality of vulnerability, potentially fracturing social cohesion as dissent whispers grow from underground networks reaching 100,000 participants. For the bystander world, it poses an existential query: does humanity's drive for retribution perpetuate cycles that engulf innocence, as seen in the displacement of 3 million refugees fleeing the intensified front, their stories weaving a tapestry of lost futures that challenge our complacency? In this pause amid the rubble, we glimpse the human dimension, the factory worker in Donetsk pondering survival's price, or the diplomat in Geneva weighing words against the void of escalation, underscoring how psychological fractures precede physical collapse, turning allies into adversaries in the theater of minds. The depth intensifies as societies grapple with the aftermath. Russia's youth, numbering 40 million under 30, increasingly question narratives of glory, with online forums buzzing at rates triple the norm, hinting at a generational pivot that could redefine the social contract in ways unforeseen. Yet herein resides the gravity. This crisis transcends tactics, inviting a philosophical meditation on interconnected fates, where the strikes serve as a mirror to our shared vulnerabilities, reminding that in the balance of fear and hope, the true battle rages within, shaping destinies for billions yet to come. To track these unfolding human dimensions and the revelations they birth without missing a beat, subscribe now and remain vigilant. It feels as though the real unraveling has only just ignited. The shadows of tomorrow loom larger than the blasts of today.